Hello, everybody, and welcome to another week of History 218. We're going to get started on the Cold War, beginning a little bit before the World War II is over. And just to define the Cold War, this means a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, even though they never actually fought directly, and that's what makes it cold. When we talk about hot wars, we'll talk about some hot wars as we go along here. What we mean is that there's actual fighting that goes on. In the Cold War, it's a series of non-direct, non-conflict actions. There are proxy wars fought, of course, but it's really this bipolar world where everybody has to choose sides. Everybody in around the world, in Europe to Africa and Asia, are forced to choose sides between capitalism in the United States on the one hand, or communism in the Soviet Union on the other. So when we're talking about the Cold War, that is the definition. The origins of the Cold War begin in World War II, and they reflect the experiences of each country. The Soviet Union was devastated by World War II, and the United States flourished economically and socially because of the war. We saw on the last PowerPoint that we ended with, the World War II PowerPoint, the massive civilian casualties that came out of World War II for the Soviet Union, while the United States, they sold stuff to every allied country, meaning this economic boom for the country. And when the economy is doing well, people in general are doing well. After the war, though, the Soviets want more security. Twice in since 1914, the Soviet Union had been invaded by Germany, so they do want some more security. And that it goes back even further, 100 years or so before World War I starts. They're invaded by Napoleon, so they do want the security buffer zone in Europe to protect themselves against more powerful Western European nations. And they also are interested in the spread of communism. As part of communist ideology, there's this idea of a worldwide revolution, a worldwide communist revolution that is popular in communist ideology. The United States, on the other hand, though, they want to spread democracy, and we'll get into the debates about what that actually means and how democratic some of these places that the United States is getting involved in actually ends up. So this is, though, on the whole, this bipolar world wherein everybody has to choose a side. And we'll really go back to the Atlantic Charter in 1941. The Atlantic Charter signed in the summer of 1941 between Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, and Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1941. They create this Atlantic Charter to lay out their vision of what the war will do, what the outcome of the war will be, where things like no trade barriers between peoples and self-determination become ideals. For example, the Soviet Union, though, coming out of this Atlantic Charter ideal that they're not exactly part of, they really have more self-interest at heart. So for a while during the war, like we discussed, the Soviets were really kind of by themselves. And Stalin thinks that the West, that means Great Britain and the United States, he's pretty sure that they are letting him lose because going back to what we talked about in the World War II PowerPoint, he was convinced that the United States and the United States and Great Britain wanted the Nazis just to wipe out communism so they wouldn't have to deal with it later. There's very little truth to that because while the Soviet Union or the United States and Great Britain thought that communism was bad, they thought that fascism and the Nazis were even worse. So that's why the big push to take down Germany was undertaken by all these countries together. Not to say that Churchill and Roosevelt liked the Soviet Union all that much at all. There is some degree of U.S. United States economic aid to the Soviet Union. The U.S. can outproduce everybody during the war and slightly before and slightly after, but they couldn't get as much stuff to the Soviet Union as they could to Great Britain. And Stalin thought during the war that that was deliberate in order to hurt the Soviets even more. He was pretty sure that the U.S. was just going to let the Soviets and Germany fight it out. I mean, we know that it didn't happen that way, but he's pretty sure of it. Back to that idea of he's a very paranoid person, and we'll keep coming back to that idea as we go along here. So in terms of dealing with occupied territories, there is a tentative agreement made at this place called Yalta, Y-A-T Yalta. Sorry, I don't know how to spell. In 1945, and this was the occupied territories that would come out of after the war between the Soviets and the United States and Great Britain. So whoever occupied the area has a lot of say about what happened to it after the war, and that's kind of what came out of Yalta. The understanding, Franklin Roosevelt got the idea that there would at least be free elections of some kind, but it doesn't exactly happen that way all over the place. The future of Germany is a big deal because, again, the Soviets do want to keep Germany weak because they're sick of being invaded. They had been the aggressors in the past two world wars, uh, sort of, right? Especially in World War II. So the idea is between the U.S., the Great Britain, and the Soviet Union is to divide Germany up. So that's what comes out of Yalta. The decision is that they should divide Germany at least in half to keep them in check. The atomic bomb is also a big Cold War origin point because it's known as the Manhattan Project in the United States, and it had been this top secret $2 billion project that the U.S. was undertaking. Great Britain knew about it. Stalin didn't know about it until after they had detonated the bomb. So Stalin does, his paranoia acts up, and there are some deliberate reasons that that the United States and Great Britain did not tell him about it, but he's not having any of it. So he feels left out, if you will. All right, we can go over some of the personalities, the major personalities, uh, towards the end or the beginning of the Cold War. Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin, of course, are the big ones. Franklin Roosevelt here on the left, Stalin with his great mustache here on the right. This guy is Harry Truman up here on the top right. So Franklin Roosevelt thought that the U.S. and the Soviets had a pretty good relationship, but he was a very forceful and strong personality. There's been countless pages written about Franklin Roosevelt and sort of his worldview and how he thought he could deal with the world, and he was pretty sure that he could deal with the Soviets. For example, he called Stalin Uncle Joe, Joseph Stalin, just because he thought he was an amiable guy who he could work with. On the other hand, the State Department, the U.S. State Department, didn't trust the Soviets at all. They didn't trust them as far as they could throw a stick, if that's the expression I want. But he ended up dying in April before the war ended. So this, in the top right, Harry Truman takes over. And some interesting notes about Truman is that he had no idea that the Manhattan Project was a thing until the day he became president. So even the vice president of the United States didn't know about it. But he also has no experience with foreign business of any kind. He came out of a political machine in Missouri, did Truman, and he sort of rose the ranks of government, and he became vice president eventually. He wasn't Roosevelt's first vice president. He was only the most recent vice president. But he takes over. He listens to the State Department, so he decides that it's in his best interest, in the United States' best interest, not to trust the Soviets at all. So there's once Franklin Roosevelt dies, there becomes a much less amiable relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. We also get some continuing disputes after the war between the Soviets and the United States, especially in Eastern Europe. Churchill famously delivers this Iron Curtain speech where he talks about the descent of this Iron Curtain over the eastern half of Europe because the Soviets had prevented them from hosting free elections. So the United States develops this policy called the containment policy. I wish I had it written down up here, but I don't. Known as National Security Council 68. It's the National Security Council Report number 68, wherein they develop this idea, the United States develops this idea of the containment policy, followed by the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine, he delivers a speech in 1947. There's some background here in Turkey and Greece, and what's happening in Turkey and Greece is that there are possible communist revolutions happening in both of those countries. So the United States decides to respond with the Truman Doctrine, or at least Truman decides to respond with this Truman Doctrine. And what the Truman Doctrine really lays out is that the United States will help any country resisting communism around the world, anywhere in the world. And so this is where Turkey and Greece, that's where that comes in, because they're resisting this communist revolution, both of them separately but internally. So initially that's rejected by Congress. They decided they needed to pitch it better. Truman decides he needed to pitch it to them better. He talks about it, how it's bigger than just one country, and eventually gets Congress to agree to it. And Truman Doctrine becomes sort of the law of the land as far as the United States is concerned. And we'll come back to the Truman Doctrine a ton this semester. And just to reiterate what the Truman Doctrine is, it's that the Truman says the United States will help any country around the world who are actively resisting communism. Now, the Marshall Plan is another part of this containment policy. And the Marshall Plan is an economic policy, an economic plan, wherein this guy, he had been a general, General Marshall for the United States, decides to help upwards of 16 countries in Western Europe by sending $13 billion worth of money and food and materials and aid in general to some of these Western European countries to help prevent the spread of communism in Europe. There are lots of strong communist parties in places like France and Italy, and the idea behind the Marshall Plan was if they're doing well economically, they won't want to fall or go to communism, so they won't vote in communist parties. Stalin, for his part, vetoes any aid going to Eastern Europe. And when we're talking about Eastern Europe, I'm going to show you a map here in a little while where we're talking about the differences between Western and Eastern Europe. And so with that, Eastern European nations don't receive any of the aid from the Marshall Plan. And here is sort of a cartoon from the time. So this is American aid to Europe, represented by this rather angry-looking sun, but he's not supposed to be that angry. But it's supposed to be melting this communist snowman. I think we all get the implication here. Now here's this map that I was talking about, and this is the establishment of NATO as part of containment. NATO is established in 1949. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and NATO comes up in the news an awful lot today. Not to bring current politics into it, but this is the thing that Donald Trump has been talking about recently, where everybody in NATO should have to pay their fair share, that kind of thing, just for a sense of that NATO still exists. So NATO is developed, and you can see these countries in orange at it takes, there's various times. We're going to go on a later PowerPoint, we'll decide or to figure out when they all joined this organization. And on the other side, the response a year later from the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin is that they developed their own sort of mutual defense organization, and they call theirs the Warsaw Pact, Warsaw being the capital of Poland, where the pact was signed by all these countries in this sort of pale green color here. So these would be all the Warsaw Pact countries. There are some neutral countries here, notably Switzerland, Austria, Yugoslavia is its own kind of a thing for at least a little while. This is immediately following the war. And you'll notice, as opposed to modern borders, the Czech Republic, it's still Czechoslovakia at this point. East Germany is split from West Germany. Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore, but it exists for this whole time period that we're talking about. So there are some differences here from a modern map, but I mean, it's all the same, stuff there, just with artificial boundaries drawn around it. But on the whole, the NATO and the Warsaw Pact are mutual defense pacts. The idea is that if one member nation is attacked, every nation is attacked by the others, and with that idea, there would be a mutual defense policy among all of them. Now, we decided that there was no direct fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States during the whole of the Cold War, but that doesn't mean that there weren't conflicts. And some of the early Cold War conflicts we're going to go over here. The first one is the Berlin blockade. And what happens here? Berlin, the capital of Germany. If we go back, this star right here, that's Berlin, and you'll notice that it's pretty much, I'm pointing to it, like you can see what I'm pointing at, in the center of the Soviet-controlled East Germany. But remember from that map I showed at the end of the World War II PowerPoint, the United States and Great Britain and France have sectors in Berlin, notably called West Berlin. So what happens is that Stalin just cuts off Berlin, decides that the U.S. can't drop in anymore or bring in any more supplies over land. So the United States, for their part, decides to ship in supplies by air, and this it becomes what's known as the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift lasts for about 11 months. Initially, nobody in the United States knew how Stalin would respond. Truman initially sent B-52 bombers with atom bombs to England, just in case Stalin decided to get hostile about it. Another early Cold War conflict is this arms race. The arms race involves atomic weapons. So we remember we've talked about arms races before, leading up to World War I and I guess just World War I. We'll talk about this arms race as we go along here. Uh, so the arms race really gets going because the United States is the only country with atomic weapons for a few years here. But spies, people like this guy Klaus Fuchs, he's a German name. He is a spy for the Soviets, and he ends up selling secrets pretty much to the Soviet Union concerning atomic weapons. And the Soviet Union finally successfully tests their own atomic bomb, excuse me, in August of 1949. So the United States starts working on their next project, this thing called the hydrogen bomb, spearheaded by men like Edward Teller. And the hydrogen bomb is about 1,000 times more powerful than just regular atomic bombs. The first hydrogen bomb is tested by the United States. Oops. Sorry, I skipped over this here. So this is from 1949, just a newspaper clipping. So here's the slide on the hydrogen bombs. They're 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The United States tests their first hydrogen bomb successfully by 1953, and I'll have a video clip of what a hydrogen bomb explosion looks like here in a second. So here's a YouTube video that I'll include on the module page of Edward Teller talking about the first the Trinity test, the first hydrogen bomb test, and I'll just sit back and let you listen to him.
And it comes out that stopped where I was 10 miles from point zero at minus 30 seconds. Then silence, long time. I was sure it misfired. I was lying on the ground as it started, looking at it, not as it started. Heavy welding glass. And then at the right time, although I thought it was too late, there was it was early in the morning, quite dark, a very weak amount of light. I remember clearly in the first second, my thought was, is this all? Then I remembered I had this heavy welding glass on and gloves, so no light could enter. So when this light, maybe in 2 seconds, started to fade, I tipped my hand and looked down at the sand. And you know, it was as though he had removed the curtain and bright sunlight came. Then I was in. Then I saw the brilliant flash, not looking at it, but looking at the sand next to it. And of course, you know, we all were very much aware of the point that in a few weeks, this would not be just an experiment. And some of us, including me, did have real doubts whether this should be used without first demonstrating.
So that was Edward Teller talking about the hydrogen bomb. The United States gets their first one in 1953. A year later, the Soviet Union get their own hydrogen bomb, and that's when the weapons stockpile really kicks in. And just to let you know some things about some of these nuclear weapons, Robert Oppenheimer, the man who's sort of in charge of the development of the first atomic weapon, called them weapons of genocide because they were designed to kill so many people all at once. Now we'll move to the first place that the Cold War turns hot, if I can make a little bit of a joke. And that place is in Korea. Now, Korea was occupied by Japan during most of World War II. And for a lot of their history, they had been an occupied nation. So they are divided, though, after World War II. So it's divided in half after World War II. And it was divided based on the Soviet and United States' sides because it was part of the liberation. The Soviets come in, as do the United States. And both of these countries, Soviets and the U.S., kind of pull out in 1949 and just sort of leave them to their own methods. In the North, they're led by this guy named Kim Il-sung, who is grandfather to the current leader of North Korea, who you hear about a lot in the news. Kim Jong-il? No, is it? Who is? Hold on. So they're led by Kim Jong-il after Kim Il-sung. Today, it's Kim Jong-un is the leader, who is direct descendant from Kim Il-sung, who was a leader during and after World War II. So Kim decides that he wants to reunite the country, and he invades the South from the north. The United States thinks that he is working for the Soviet Union. Like, they think that the Soviets said, okay, go ahead and do this. We now know that he just sort of did it on his own without the Soviets really knowing anything about it. And it begins as a United Nations issue. This is one of the first big issues tackled by the United Nations, which had been created after World War II. So the United Nations is the more modern version of the League of Nations, which sort of didn't do much of anything. There is a General Assembly and a Security Council of the United Nations that deal with affairs like these. The United Nations is actually very inefficient because the United States and Soviet Union both have veto power on the UN Security Council. So not much really happens there. Anytime the United States passes something, the Soviets would veto it, and vice versa. So that's the situation we're looking at in Korea. To this point. As far as the United States is concerned, this goes back to the idea of containment when they're talking about containing communism, because North Korea had been a communist country. That's why the United States thought that the Soviets were actually directing Kim Il-sung and the invasion of the South. So the United States responds by sending in soldiers led by General Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur leads the counterattack, and it is actually so successful that it goes beyond just containment. And if we follow the arrows here, so here's the North Korean attack, the initial North Korean attack, they make it all the way around this defensive line here at Pusan. So the United Nations counterattack led by the United States makes it this far north to this line here, and that's when the Chinese get involved, because the Chinese are afraid that the United States will just keep going and actually involve or go past the borders and cross the Yalu River into China. So China, with North Korea, reinvades, and they make it all the way down here past Seoul and make it to this line here. And then there's another counterattack a year later, and then this is sort of the dividing line, the armistice line that's signed along the 38th parallel, more or less. So just to come back to it, in November of 1950, around 300,000 Chinese soldiers pour over the Yalu River in the invasion. That's a rather large or sizable portion of the Chinese army, and that's where that pushback comes from. And it's at that point that MacArthur suggests that the United States should invade China itself, or possibly drop an atomic bomb on China, which had been a pretty popular idea at home, but the president at the time ended up deciding against it. So we get the stalemate for the next 2 years, wherein President Truman ends up dismissing General MacArthur, which reinforces that a civilian is commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army. This is sort of a big issue in U.S. history, because there was a general, this General MacArthur, was challenging the power of the president. And so I have a political cartoon that sort of illustrates this. People calling for Truman's dismissal. So here's this, MacArthur was dismissed, but people were calling to impeach President Truman, and the cartoon reads, "Who does Truman think he is? The president, being commander-in-chief of all." And this reinforces that in the United States, it's a civilian in charge of the military, that the president is always the commander-in-chief. It is not generals who make decisions about whether or not nuclear weapons can be used. Another thing that this war changes is that wars are no longer, especially in the Cold War, these drawn-out, large-scale industrial wars that they had been in the previous world wars. They were more limited wars with more specific goals in mind. Since World War II, wars have been limited. I mean, and I don't want to tell you anybody who's involved in one of these conflicts, it wasn't limited to them, but they are limited, smaller operations rather than these large-scale wars. World War II was the last huge, large-scale war wherein the entire population was mobilized in multiple countries for a war at home and wherever the fighting takes place. So this is a bit of a change. By the end of the Korean War, though, we're getting some new leaders. Truman has served out his term. In the United States, we get President Dwight Eisenhower, who had been, I guess you could call him the hero of World War II. He was an American general who led the forces in Europe. And the Soviet side, Nikita Khrushchev is the new Soviet premier. Joseph Stalin ended up dying in 1954. He had some serious health problems, and I guess it's a funny story because he was something of a horrible person, but he had actually been bleeding uh, for pretty much an entire night, but everybody was too afraid. He was laying on a couch. Everybody, though, was too afraid to walk up to him and see if anything was wrong. So it took a rather long time to find him, in long time in terms of dying. It took a long time to find him there. And after he dies, there's this period of what are they going to do now? But we get Nikita Khrushchev. He had been a general in the Soviet army during World War II, so he's kind of popular in the Soviet Union. These are the two new leaders that emerge in the early 1950s of the U.S. and Soviet Union, and to some extent, it becomes this time period of peaceful coexistence. But still, they're stockpiling weapons. Both sides are. They're still testing nuclear weapons. But on the whole, it is kind of this area, this time period of peaceful coexistence. This peaceful coexistence comes to something of a grinding halt in 1957 with the launch of what's known as Sputnik here. So Sputnik was a Russian satellite, a Soviet satellite. It's the first man-made object to be launched into space in the history of ever. So this changes the United States' advantage because for the first time, a country can send something into space, and of course the natural fear would be that if you could send something into space, you could send it into space to drop nuclear weapons. On the other, you don't need a plane necessary to deliver a nuclear bomb. So the Soviets also in 1957 test their first ICBM. ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. This would be a missile that could be launched from one continent and hit another one. So that's what we're talking about here. And the Soviets are the first to do that. So this we're getting the changing ideas of who has the advantage in this Cold War. Khrushchev, for his part, is touting across the world that the Soviets are becoming more powerful than even the United States was at the time. And I will include a video here of what's known as the Kitchen Summit. Where Khrushchev talks about the differences between the Soviet life and American life, and he's trying to explain how life in the Soviet Union is so much better. But it brings this question about a missile gap. Is there a missile gap between the United States and Soviet Union? President Dwight Eisenhower knew that the Soviet Union wasn't more powerful than the U.S. was in terms of how many weapons they had, but he didn't want to tell anybody or let anybody know how they knew, how he knew. The reason was because of these U-2 reconnaissance planes, not just the name of a popular band, but these U-2 reconnaissance planes could fly so high that they were undetectable by Soviet radar at the time. And so there was this rather lengthy period wherein the top echelon of the United States government knew that they had more missiles than the Soviet Union, but they just couldn't tell everybody that they knew how. So here's just a cartoon at the time of this peaceful coexistence idea, but you see they both have their fingers crossed, even in the cartoon. This dates back to 1959. So whether or not it was actually peaceful coexistence, I guess, is a little bit up for debate. The space race is another big issue during this time frame, and it really gets going with the launch of Sputnik. The Soviets are the first to do that. But then we have the first human in space was this guy, Yuri Gagarin. In 1961, the Soviet Union launches the first person into space, and in a couple of weeks, we're actually going to watch a much longer video on the space race, and we'll get into Yuri Gagarin a little bit more. And this guy on the right, or on the bottom, Wernher von Braun, he's a German, an ex-German scientist. He left Germany after World War II. He had been working on a rocket program there, and he comes to the United States and really heads up the United States' space program. So it's only a year after Yuri Gagarin, though, that the United States launches our first person into space. That guy would be John Glenn, of course. It's symbolic more than anything else to see who's first. By 1969, though, there's an image of John Glenn in 1962. By 1969, though, the United States wins the space race, if you will, by landing on the moon first. The total cost in U.S. dollars is about $21 billion for the space race, and you can tout whatever conspiracy theories you want, but the moon landing actually happened. So the U.S. won the space race, even though the Soviets had a lot of early successes in it. I guess the goal here was to get to the moon, though. So elsewhere in Cold War history, the Berlin Wall is something that we've probably all heard of. Sort of towards the end of the class, we'll talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's no big secret there. Berlin actually had been an escape route, though, for pretty much all of Eastern Europe up till 1961. And if we just come back to this map here, we can see, so here's Berlin in the middle of East Germany, and there's sort of this free range, not completely free, but communists could move around different communist countries. This Iron Curtain existed that was difficult to pass. So one idea was to get into East Berlin or West Berlin, which was controlled by the American side, and after you get to East Berlin, you can fly out into the Western Europe. And so Khrushchev responds by erecting the Berlin Wall in 1961, and this pretty much is sort of the defining moment wherein you can't get out of Eastern Europe anymore unless it's much more sneakily than that. And there's some movies that go into some creative ways that people would escape from East Berlin to West Berlin. I'm trying to think of a good example, but nothing's coming to me now. Also, in the early 1960s, we get this Bay of Pigs fiasco, if you will. Now we're going to come back to South America a little bit later on, but we got to start with Cuba. And in Cuba, we get this revolution in 1959. It's a communist revolution. And in response to the Truman Doctrine, which stated the U.S. would help any country resisting communist influence, the Soviet Union issues a similar proclamation stating that they will help anybody who is trying to become communist or resisting capitalism. And so Cuba becomes sort of a satellite of the Soviet Union in terms of world influence. It's led by this guy who just recently died a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it was a couple of months ago at this point. Fidel Castro. He leads the Cuban Revolution along with another guy who we'll talk about more when we talk more about South America in a couple of weeks. Here is a picture of Khrushchev with Castro and some guys who are a little too close for comfort surrounding them. But this Bay of Pigs thing, let's get back to this for a second. So Castro, for his part, he isn't much of a communist at first. He's more of a nationalist, but the Communist Party is the one who is the most nationalist of these revolutionary parties. He doesn't care for U.S. capitalism all that much, though. But when he takes over, Eisenhower had actually planned this Bay of Pigs invasion, or at least it was planned while he was president. And so in 1961, we get this, it's a bay in Cuba, this invasion, but it ends up pushing him further toward the Soviet Union and Khrushchev in general. And what it was a CIA-led operation where the United States, with some Cubans who were living in exile outside of Cuba, they were armed by the CIA and sent into Cuba to try. The ultimate goal was to take out Castro from power, and it's a massive failure and sort of an embarrassment to the Kennedy administration, even though it was initially planned during Eisenhower's administration. Which brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba had been pushed closer and closer towards the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union ended up putting missiles in Cuba. And if we look at a map of the Western Hemisphere, you'll notice that Cuba is only about 90 miles away from Florida, which scares the heck out of a whole bunch of Americans. But the Soviets put their missiles there for a couple of reasons. One, they put them there to protect their communist ally, which was Cuba. Another reason they do it is that Castro and Khrushchev didn't think it would be initially that big of a deal, because there were already some of these similar type of missiles in Turkey. The United States had similar missiles in Turkey, which you'll notice is right on the border, quite literally, with the Soviet Union. So the thinking was, well, the United States is doing it, so maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal if the Soviets did it in Cuba too. Um, so they thought that the United States would have the same idea. And how does the U.S. find out about this? Well, it's a U-2 plane that takes pictures, is taking pictures over top of Cuba, and they find that these missile sites are being erected. The military wanted to invade Cuba, but President Kennedy said no. And I'll include a clip on the modules from this movie, 13 Days, where it shows Kennedy talking with his cabinet about how best uh, to handle this situation, this Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. military, again, did want to invade to take out these missile sites. The Air Force was on board with it too, but Kennedy said no. One problem during this Cuban Missile Crisis is that there were no real communications direct between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. It was through some back channels that the U.S. is communicating with the Soviets that they need to stop and pull these missiles out. The Soviets say that they'll only do it if the United States agrees not to invade Cuba and remove those missiles from Turkey. Uh, the U.S. agrees initially not to invade, but not to the missiles yet. Um, we get this image of President Kennedy. He addresses the nation on October 22nd of 1962. He says that they're going to quarantine Cuba, all missiles going into Cuba. Specifically, he doesn't want to say blockade because that sounds like a war term. So the quarantine, though, it does work. Soviet ships had orders to keep going until somebody stopped them. Those were Khrushchev's orders. And with the quarantine, the Soviet Union actually does back down, and JFK agrees behind closed doors to pull those missiles out of Turkey. Afterwards, so here's just an image of the blockade. Afterwards, direct forms of communication do emerge, and there is an agreement between these two countries to lessen their missile stockpiles around each other's countries. So that's a good introduction to Cold War history. I'll see you next video.